Really delighted to introduce our next panel. In particular, one of the things that Francesca and I also wanted to make sure that we underscored is that we wanted to thank all of the moderators of all of our panels for all of the hard work they've done to help us to organize this event. So Matt Baum is the Marvin Cowell Professor of Global Communications and Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School and Department of Government. He has his PhD from UCSD, was previously a professor at UCLA before joining Harvard. I should say he sat right to the left on the stage. He's on stage right, waving. His research focus is on delineating the effects of domestic politics on international conflict and cooperation, particularly in American foreign policy, as well as on the role of the mass media and public opinion in contemporary American politics. This is going to be a panel about the science of misinformation. So that part of his research profile fits extremely well. I wanted to note that beyond his work in scholarly journals, he's written 3 books. I won't read them here, but suffice to say they sound extremely interesting. And he's also a regular writer of op-ed articles. So I'm just delighted that Professor Matt Baum from the Kennedy School and Department of Government has agreed to chair today's panel. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. So I have a relatively modest role. My job is to introduce the panelists and give them a couple of questions to chew on. So I've asked them each to limit themselves to 3 to 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then I will suggest a couple of questions, and then we will reserve time for an interaction with the audience for your questions. So I'm going to start just by introducing our panelists. So I'll just introduce the whole row, and then we can go in the order in which they're in the program, or at least the version of it that I have. So I'm going to start with Yochai Benkler, who is the Jack N. and Lillian R. Berkman Professor for Entrepreneurial Legal Studies and the Faculty Co-Director of the Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society at the Harvard Law School. Since the 1990s, Benkler has played a key role in characterizing the role of information commons and decentralized collaboration to innovation, information production, and freedom in the networked economy and society. He's the author of The Wealth of Networks, How Social Production Transforms Markets and Freedom, among other books. In 2012, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Oxford University in recognition of his contribution to the study and public understanding of the internet and information goods. He's won the Ford Foundation Visionaries Award in 2011, the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award for 2007, and the Public Knowledge IP3 Award in 2006. Most recently, he set his sights on understanding online polarization and misinformation, hence his presence on this panel. Our second panelist is Brooke Foucault-Wells, who's an associate professor of communication studies at Northeastern University. She combines the methods of network science with theories from the social sciences to study how online communication networks facilitate the pursuit of individual, team, and collective goals. Her work's been featured in leading social science journals, such as the Journal of Communication, Information, Communication, and Society, and the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. She serves on the editorial board of the journal Web Science and was part of the team that developed the network literacy, essential concepts, and core ideas. Next is David Lazar, who is a distinguished professor of political science and computer and information science and co-director for the new lab for text, maps, and networks at Northeastern University. His research centers on social networks, governance, or how the patterns of institutional relations yield functional or dysfunctional systems, and technology and its use in communication. He's an authority on social networks. He's written papers on the diffusion of information among interest groups and between these groups and the government. He's the co-editor of Governance and Information Technology, From Electronic Government to Information Government, and he's also written extensively on the use of DNA in the criminal justice system. And finally, last but certainly not least, Alice Marwick, who's an assistant professor of media and technology studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's faculty advisor to the Media Manipulation Initiative at the Data and Society Research Institute at her university. She researches the social political, and cultural implications of popular social media technologies. In 2017, she co-authored Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online, a flagship report examining the far-right online subculture's use of social media to spread disinformation. And for this, she was named one of 2017's Global Thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. She's also author of Status Updates, Celebrity, Publicity, and Branding in the Social Media Age in 2013. This is an ethnographic study of the San Francisco tech scene, which examines how people seek social status through online visibility. I think I'll stop there. There's more in each of their cases, but that's enough of an introduction. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panelists for their introductory comments. And why don't we just go in the order that I just introduced you also, starting with Professor Benkler.
Okay. I'm here now because I'm co-PI of a project called Media Cloud that has about 1 billion stories from around the world and collects about 1 million a day from 60,000 sources from almost every country in the world. We have plenty of data for text analysis, link analysis, tweet analysis, Facebook sharing analysis. Come play in the water if you like to play. It's nice, it's warm, it's messy. The data is open, and we are looking for collaborators. Matt asked us to sort of ask, what do we think we know? What do we think we know that we don't know? And what should we be thinking about that data science could help us think about? And I'd say what we think we know on misinformation is that it affects attitudes and behavior. We're operating on the assumption that it affects attitudes and behavior, and we don't know that that's true. We don't know that that's true because of a variety of difficulties, not least of which is our data that are available for analysis come from a discrete set of platforms that do not necessarily represent the whole, and that if they do whatever they do represent intersects in ways we don't understand with other sources. So if the question to Cynthia Dwork in the morning was, what do you do about labor markets and how they impact? And the answer is, we don't know, we can't do that, we have what we have. How do you think, and this is the book that we just came out with, how do you think about misinformation on Twitter, which you can track, on the background of Hannity and Fox News and Limbaugh and talk radio in the overall environment? How do you think about Russian advertising in the context of the entire media blitz of advertising and propaganda? So we think we know. We don't have individual level data with behavioral outcome measures. Maybe David can talk otherwise about that. We don't have behavioral outcomes, and we don't have enough of the universe of elements that go in the media ecosystem into determining behaviors and attitudes and their change to be able to do that. We need to expand the data sets, major issues with bringing TV in, and transcripts and images, talk radio, opening up Facebook data in a way that's much more substantial than there is now. That's the challenge. And I think it's fairly obvious to understand how various elements of data science can help solve it. What's a significant societal concern in this space of misinformation, disinformation, belief and attitude and behavior manipulation that can be solved or addressed by data science? I think there's a broad concern in people looking at the way the advertising-based business models and data-rich models online are developing, that the core business strategy of the major companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, is massive surveillance of behaviors and massive experimentation for purposes of behavioral manipulation that is then sold to whoever wants to manipulate the behavior, whether it's a political campaign or whether it's a commercial campaign. If this is true, it essentially makes liberal society impossible. The idea is that markets clear preferences, not that markets shape preferences. Otherwise, we have no idea that markets are efficient. The idea is that democracy is self-governance because it affects because it reflects what people want, not because it manipulates people. There's a strong interest not to reveal that data from the companies that are using it for behavioral manipulation, and we're going to require substantial political and regulatory intervention to force that data so that we begin to think about the health of our media ecosystem the way we think about public health and the way in which we have structures for assurance both of access to the data from the platforms and from the users, and to assure their privacy and autonomy within that constraint. Needless to say, since it's completely solved in medicine, our life will be easy, but we need to be thinking in terms of creating that data set in the same way as we think for public health at the level of media ecosystems, how they're used to manipulate, and what the actual impact on beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors is.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Welch?
So thanks for putting together the panel. I'm excited to be here. So as Matt mentioned in the introduction, I am an associate professor of communication. I'm also a member of the Network Science Institute. I've been researching online communication since pretty close to the start of when the mainstream US population was using the internet to communicate with one another. And lately, for the past 5 or so years, I've been focusing particularly on what folks from marginalized communities are doing on the internet in order to create social change. The question that I always ask and that I always encourage folks to ask when we study online communication, or frankly any kind of technology, is what's really new here? So there's a lot of understandable concern right now about things like media manipulation, about misinformation, about agenda setting and propaganda. These, of course, are the questions that are at the heart of the field of communication. They're questions we've been asking for 50, 100, 1,000 years. So these are not new questions. Are nation states using the media to manipulate elections? It's a question that the field of communication, the modern instantiation of the field, was founded on. So I think these are important questions to ask. It's also important to understand that the answers are not going to come from this panel today. They're probably not going to come in the next year or 5 years. And then we need to keep asking them. Happily, we now do have sources of data that allow us to unravel some of the mysteries of how communication spread, who saw it, how they saw it, and potentially whether or not their attitudes and behaviors were changed by it. I think that's new, right? So our access to data to start answering these questions is exciting, and I think we will see developments. I think the other thing that is potentially new is that, at least in some cases, we're seeing a subversion of the power the sources that could do this sort of thing. So not always. Of course, we do still have nation states and major media outlets, either intentionally or unintentionally propagating misinformation. But in other cases, we have individual people doing it. And we have individual people who are potentially anonymous or never known to us. And that is relatively new, right? So it's a function of our ability to both create messages easily and spread them to large audiences easily. So I think that's worth additional attention. If I were placing bets about where we should be spending our money in order to understand what's going on, that's what I would say. Just a note on marginalized voices. So because I've been focusing particularly on women, LGBTQ folks, and people of color, I think it's important when we talk about misinformation to mention that just because I haven't heard a message before, or because the average US politician hasn't heard a message before, or even the average member of mainstream America hasn't heard a message before, does not necessarily make it wrong. It does not necessarily make it untrue. And in fact, I think much of what we view right now as potentially misinformation is the bubbling up of very real experiences that folks are having And I promised to stick to 5 minutes, but I'll give you one very short anecdote from research that I did on tweets about the protests in Baltimore following Freddie Gray's death. So we saw in there this very interesting dynamic where sort of two different competing hashtags emerged. So one was Baltimore riot and one was Baltimore uprising. And people were negotiating sort of at the center. If you looked at the intersection of those hashtags, people were negotiating about what was going on the ground. Was it a riot or was it an uprising, the kind of righteous response to injustice? And people were using evidence from the ground to justify their perspective. So the riot folks kept showing this CVS that was on fire. And there was, in fact, a CVS on fire. That's not wrong. The uprising folks kept showing people with bullhorns passing out water, which also was right. So for folks who've been to a protest on the ground, that's what protests normally look like, right? So it's folks talking into bullhorns and handing out sandwiches and water. And both of those narratives were true, and we saw at least a little bit of hope in the intersection of those where people were coming to have conversations about the fact that those images can coexist. So Baltimore was both an uprising and a CVS on fire, which we can argue about whether or not that constitutes a riot. But those were true. So I think the kind of multiplicity of those messages, at least there's the promise that we can kind of reconcile and they can coexist, not only in the minds of people who are there and the minds of people who participate actively in these events, but also in the minds of the greater mainstream public. So we can expand our understanding of what it means to be in a protest following the death of a Black man at the hands of a police officer.
Thank you very much. That's what was up.
Thank you. I want to again thank the organizers of the panel and of today. I'm pleased to be on this panel with all of you. This is just a terrific group. I'm going to just throw out a few provocations. I'm going to keep it pretty snappy, and then if you have questions, you can either ask them or grab me after the panel. I think the idea here is to set of provocations to get things going that people may or may not agree with. So point one, it's not clear that the misinformation problem today is worse than it was, say, a generation ago or 2 generations ago. Right? I live in a town that used to be the headquarters for the John Birch Society. Right? Now it's an Armenian cultural society. Right? We've always had institutions and mechanisms to disseminate misinformation. Many of them were very difficult to track, just logistically, like talk radio. Talk radio has not been a high quality source of information going back to the 1930s, but it's been a black hole for analysis. Part of the beauty of the internet and computational methods is that we can turn over a lot of rocks and see what's underneath it. But the rocks were there and the stuff underneath them was there before. Maybe it's a lot worse now, but I suspect we'll never really come up with a great comparable metric over time. But I think it was probably, if you want to put glass half full, half empty, the glass was half empty, a generation ago or 2 generations ago. So, point 2, I think too much has been made of filter bubbles, and I think scholarship is gradually pointing this way, that actually people get exposed to a lot of discordant information online. And in fact, actually that doesn't always result in very functional reactions, right? There was a nice PNAS paper out a few weeks ago showing if you put information in people's Twitter feeds that they actually tend to polarize more. And so, I think there was this convergence around the internet and the filter bubble, the Daily Me and so on, let's say on a decade or so, 10, 15 years ago. I think that's actually helped inform a lot of platform policy. So if you go to Google now, right, if you Google for political information, if you Google for pizza, you'll find the pizza place down the block, right? If you Google, who is my member of Congress, you're just going to get a generic site that says, who is your member of Congress, right? But you're not actually going to get different information here than you would in California, say. So Google has purposely decided, maybe for filter bubble reasons, for certain kinds of information to not, let's say, personalize or geographically target, even though arguably it would make it a more effective source of civic information. Twitter recently has had a policy for trying to promote discordant information on your timelines, despite the fact that actually recent research suggests quite the opposite. And in none of this, in terms of the platforms, are they embedding, as far as I can tell, embedding research to evaluate the impact of these choices, right? I think a lot of this is really being taken for granted. I think this is evolving, but a lot of this is, oh, filter bubble, okay, that's a problem, right? But you're not critically interrogating these issues is not happening nearly as much as it should be in the platforms. Third point, this is more of a data science point, but heck, this is the day to talk about it, I think, that we shouldn't really think of data science, and this is sort of like thinking of methods generally as being disembodied and detached from theory, right? Around 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I had a conference over at IQSS on computational social science, and the whole idea was thinking about how to take these, it was before the data science term, it was before big data, it was talking about how to take large-scale data to understand human systems. But the idea there was computational was the adjective and social science was the subject. That is, how do we empower and create new theory, fundamentally new theory about society and humans based on these data streams. And so we have to be very careful about taking methods divorced from theoretical context. And I think that unfortunately happens way too often. And that leads to various kinds of pathologies. I'm happy to go into that further. Another point regarding data science is sometimes contraposed to, sometimes seen as the very apotheosis of quantitative methodology. But I actually think that there are, and this goes back to the theory idea, that we should be centered around questions and deploy many methods in a synergistic way to answer those questions. And so we can think of data science as empowering, for example, qualitative methodology. Because a lot of qualitative methods are really around search, right? So like I'm interested, for example, in how members of Congress use their websites to communicate certain kinds of things. Well, that's a ton of data, and you'd like to be able to interrogate that with human interpretive abilities, but zoom in on the points that interesting things happen. And it's too much for humans to read through the gazillion of web pages, most of which are duplicative. And so to have tools that search and identify interesting spots is a critical data science question, but also it can be supportive of qualitative research. And so I just want to pull us out of that way of thinking about methods as really methods ultimately should be synergistically deployed around critical and important questions. Misinformation, information is a really important one. And the final point is I think we have our institutions, and this is well, this isn't actually technically Harvard, but it's Harvard-ish. It's the academy. It represents the academy. I think that there has been an underinvestment in thinking about, in adapting our epistemologies to these new opportunities, and also for thinking about this in an applied kind of way. How should our structures today are algorithmic, they're computational, we're governed by Google and Facebook in terms of what we see and who we see. And I don't think, and with the exception of my colleague here, for example, I don't think that, let's say if we went to the Kennedy School or other policy schools, that these kinds of structures that are changing our society are subject to nearly the magnitude of attention that they deserve. And similarly, I think our academic structures in terms of where we put computer science and where we put social sciences and where we put other types of people that we don't create. I mean, it's wonderful. This is wonderful. It's wonderful that we have this set of people in this room. This happens far too rarely. And it's important for the academy to adapt to the new possibilities that the 21st century offers. So.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Professor Marwick.
All right, so I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to summarize my last 2 years of research. So I am a qualitative social scientist, and in addition to my own work, I work with the media manipulation team at Data and Society, which is a nonprofit research institute in New York City that looks at the social impacts of data-driven technologies. And we have a very multidisciplinary social science team. We do work with some data scientists. We do work with some more humanities-oriented people. But I want to talk about sort of the two major projects I've done in the last 2 years and what I think they imply about where we're at in terms of studying disinformation. So the first project I started working on before the 2016 election, and we were looking at far-right groups in spaces like 8chan, Discord, some Reddit groups, and looking at how they were basically doing agenda setting and framing work. So they were working together to put forth either deliberately incorrect information or information that would put a particular ideological spin on an event and then use social media to spread that information into the mainstream media. And we have countless case studies of this happening. A conspiracy theory or a hoax or a prank starting in far-right circles and then moving down this chain, often using hyperpartisan media or Fox to jump into mainstream discourse. And that way there was really an opening of the Overton window, like meaning that the range of ideas in American political discourse has changed in the last 2 years, in which we suddenly have white supremacist ideas existing on a public agenda where they had been hidden or less socially acceptable in the 20, 30 years before. And one of the implications of this project was to try to focus not on fake news, not on something that is like this contentless block of this ideology-free content of bad information, which I feel like sometimes when we're thinking about misinformation or disinformation, we don't want to look at the content. We just want to think of it as like a bad thing that we have to fix or something that's incorrect, right? Like it's not a truth. But really, there are very heavy ideological aspects to many types of disinformation. And one of the problems with research is that when we're using words that were created in the era of propaganda and broadcast media to describe internet media, they often don't fit. So misinformation is used to refer to information that is not deliberately incorrect, like a paper prints something and then corrects it. And disinformation is used to refer to something that is deliberately incorrect. But as we all know, on the internet, it's really hard to ascertain intent. You often don't know where a piece of information is coming from. You're often not even sure if it's like a troll or not. It could be some crazy meme that comes from one space and then moves through 15 other things before it ends up in your Facebook group or WhatsApp group. Like there's no way to know. So we're already working with a set of concepts and ideas that were developed for a particularly different media environment. So the second project sort of follows up with this, and the paper is called Why Do People Share Fake News? And in this paper, I don't like the term fake news. I don't think it is very useful, but I think it has become a public heuristic to think about a lot of the changes in getting news from broadcast media to getting news through social media. And one of the changes is that when people share news, they're doing it in a way to signal their identities. In the same way that you would put a bumper sticker on your car, or you would share a cat video, or back in the MySpace days, you would put your favorite bands on your profile, right? There is so much personal, emotional, affective information tied up in our partisan feelings. They're often very deeply tied to our community, our racial identification, the social class that we belong to. If you have very deeply held partisan beliefs, you are not going to stop believing them because Facebook puts a fact checker in front of you. Right? And one of the problems is that we've been seeing this story of fake news with this sort of ridiculous magic bullet theory of people voted for Trump in the 2016 election because they were exposed to fake news. And I don't think we have any information that indicates that that is empirically true, or that there's any way to decide that. And one of the things that I've been doing in the Fake News Project is try to look at the continuities between disinformation and misinformation on the internet and disinformation and misinformation in partisan media. And often what we're seeing is that the information in political fake news stories is often a matter of scope and scale rather than a matter of like correct or incorrect. There's this like continuum of truthiness. So I'll give you an example. So one of the fake news stories in our corpus was some kind of sensational claptrap that said that a black man had kidnapped 17 white women and carved Black Lives Matter into their skin and stuck them in a freezer. So like the most ridiculous, racist trope you can imagine. But we have plenty of evidence of people on sites like Breitbart or on Fox News talking about how Black Lives Matter are murderers, Black Lives Matter are dangerous, Black Lives Matter are a terrorist organization. And so it's not a matter of one thing is true and one thing is false. They're both lying on the same ideological spectrum. It's just one is way more extreme and sensational because fake news exists to make money, and a lot of it is clickbait, right? And in the same corpus of fake news, we've also found a lot of stories that are very ambivalent. Like it's very hard to tell whether they're on the left or the right because they're designed to be shared and they're designed to make money. So if they can get a story that somebody on the left and the right will both share, then that's like really good for this sleazy company that's making this fake news. But I think we also need to be careful about the types of solutions that we're posing to this problem, because the two main solutions that I hear at the conferences on disinformation and misinformation that I go to, and many of us have been to a number of these conferences over the last couple of years, are fact-checking and media literacy. And not only do I don't think either of these things really work, I think they can also have unintended consequences. With fact-checking, we have plenty of evidence showing, as David said, that when somebody has a very strong belief, if they're confronted with something that counters that belief, rather than rejecting it, they often double down on their belief and disbelieve whoever's telling them it's false, right? So that's where you get these situations in which Facebook or Google is embedding fact-checking into their product, and then they're getting accusations of bias, even though they are calling out stories that are actually false. With media literacy, we're seeing something even more interesting. One of our researchers has been looking at the types of close reading that conservatives do on primary sources. So they'll like get a copy of the tax bill and they'll sit down together and they'll read it. We're also seeing conspiracy theories like QAnon, which is, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. It's like totally crazy pants, nut job stuff. But it's this series of like these short little messages that are put out on 8chan that this whole group of people will like work together to interpret. And that is a form of media literacy and critical thinking. It's basically what Henry Jenkins would have called participatory culture 10 years ago. It's just being done for political purposes. And conspiracy theories are a lot like that. So we're encouraging people to be critical and examine the source. Often we're encouraging them to like reject the New York Times and instead go to some underground forum where people are telling you the truth about George Soros and the Illuminati, right? Like, no bueno, we don't want that. So I think that we need to be really careful about what kind of solutions that we're putting forward, and we need to make sure that the solutions that we are putting forward are based on an accurate model of what this type of sharing and spread looks like, and are actually efficacy-based, where we have some kind of measurement to tell if they're doing harm or good.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I would like to exercise the panel chair's prerogative to ask the first question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we've heard a lot of bad news and alarming news so far. So I would like to sort of flip that. I know this is the tendency at these conferences, the ones that we've been traipsing through, doom and gloom and hopelessness. Give me an example of a promising development in your area of research that maps into the domain of data science that has you excited about the next 12 to 24 months, and tell us why. And let's go. Why don't we just go down in the same order, sort of starting with Yochai.
Well, coming out of our analysis, I think we spend much too much time on marginal sites like fake news or the alt-right trolls or the Russians. I think the most promising thing is that when you actually look at what it is that people read and the relative influence of traditional media, first of all, this is an incredibly American-centric conversation, and a major thing we need is cross-country study and variation to try to understand. And if I had done that in the last couple of years, instead of looking at American politics, I would have said, look at Germany that actually succeeded in not falling into the trap of having backup. There's a huge difference between whether these media permit small, intensely focused groups to collaborate and focus their attention. These groups can be people we agree with politically, and we think these are marginalized minorities that can actually set the agenda in a way that they never could. These could be horrible, terrible, no good people whom we suddenly think of as polluting, and we think of the traditional media environment as having controlled them. And different countries will have different definitions of who's the good and who's the bad. I think we have very good data in some of the research around this that can happen, that marginal groups can collate and act together. I think, though, that when we're trying to understand, and this I'm getting to the good news, when we're trying to get to understanding large-scale, population-level attention and belief formation and change, the data that we currently have suggest that we're in a much less confused environment than we think, that the overwhelming majority of people continue to exist in media ecosystems that take their marching orders from traditional professional journalistic sources. And part of the conversation and part of the reason that I spend at least half my time talking now in journalism schools and journalism context is that these professionals who actually do occupy the position of the peak attention and peak authority for, at least in the US, let's say 70-some% of the population, stop behaving as though they're in a symmetric media ecosystem where neutrality is just saying such and such side said this, such and such the other, and begin to understand that they need to actually practice objectivity as accountable and transparent journalism focused on some notion of truth rather than on neutrality. So what the data is allowing us to do is to stop looking at the shiny new objects of technology and actually try to measure what is influencing population level beliefs. My best sense of the current evidence is that traditional professional journalism has a much larger role to play than in their panic they think they do. And hopefully they will start to understand that and respond to the present sources of dislocation rather than to the panic that everybody is paying attention to Facebook and they have no idea what the difference is between the Gateway Pundit and the New York Times, which is just not true.
Thank you very much. Brooke?
Yeah, my glimmer of hope is related. Hopefully we have more than one dimension of hope, right? Yeah, I think we are, as a research community, beginning to move past the shiny object that is new media and the internet and thinking more broadly about how we both assemble and then analyze data sets that are inclusive of broader ecosystems of communication. And I did, in preparation for this, pull just a few little statistics to remind us and everyone in this room. We're fixated a bit on the influence that social media has on public opinion and on election outcomes in particular. Just as a helpful reminder, only 75% of the population uses the most popular social media platform, which is YouTube, which I don't think we talk about as much as we could be. And if we drop that down to just the kind of 50-plus crowd, it goes down to around 50%. Twitter is at the relative bottom of the heap at 24% for the population at large and only 14% for those 50 and plus folks. Local news remains our most common news source. It's the one that people get most of their news from. It's also the most trusted news source by a long shot. So if you ask folks which news they trust, 82% trust at least a little bit what's said on their local news, compared to only 34% who trust the news on social media. Right? So I think that although it is important to chase the shiny new thing and to unpack what's going on in those places, it's also important to remember that that's not where most people are getting their information. Right? And the good news is that folks in the research community and the broader sort of intellectual community are now working on assembling data sets so we can start to trace this whole ecosystem, to trace things like messages that start in these kind of extreme groups all the way out to the local news where most people are getting that information. So a colleague of mine and David's, Kenny Joseph, has been assembling a data set like this, and I just saw on Twitter this morning that Leon Yin at Data and Society just posted a Jupyter notebook with a bunch of local news links so that we can all assemble that. So if I could call on the people in the room to contribute to those data sets, I think it's extremely important. I'm glad to see that the tides are turning, not just amongst those of us who kind of specialize in communication, but among the broader research community interested in how information spreads in the population.
Yeah, as you can imagine, the people who study this stuff are really interdisciplinary, like really interdisciplinary. I mean, I study social media, I don't study journalism. So I'm coming at this from a different perspective as many of the scholars who study journalism or the political scientists or the economists who are all kind of coming together to work on these collective issues. From my perspective, some of the things that I see as being encouraging are I think people are finally starting to get beyond this fake news paradigm and looking at misinformation in a more global sense. So I'm really interested in memes and pictures to spread disinformation and misinformation. There's a new study out of Northeastern showing that something like 80% of college students get at least some political information from memes. And we know that that YouTube has been a source of a significant source of radicalization for the people in the extremist groups that we study. And when we use a fake news paradigm, we're missing a lot of these other ways that information spreads and is shared. And again, this might be specific to a younger group rather than some of the sort of folks you guys are talking about, but I still think it's important for us to be inclusive. The second thing, as both my predecessors said, is that we need to start thinking about the media environment as an ecosystem, as an environment, not just as a set of disconnected platforms. Often we do study Twitter because it's there, right? And with Twitter now shutting down the API even more, that looks like it's going to be gone. But we can't be relying on these small, like if you're going to study some random public data set, study Reddit if you want to study young people rather than Twitter. Like more of them are on Reddit, they're on Twitter, and Reddit's much easier to get to. I think we need to start expanding our view of not only looking at the connections between social media, local media, partisan media and mainstream media, which I think are extremely important, but looking at the way that people use information. Like people don't just go to Facebook or just go to Twitter. In the course of 2 minutes on their phone, they might go to like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube. You know, we need to start thinking about this not just as discrete segments. And I think people are starting to look at that, and I would echo Brooke's call for more data sets with that type of information in it.
So glimmer of hope, I guess I'd start with, for those who say things are so bad today, that on the bright side, they were never very good.
You can do better than that.
Real optimist there, David. Yeah.
Look, you know, I think that you know, if we look at things around, let's say, the American public being well or ill-informed, the American public has never been well-informed. Right? I mean, we have very good time series data on that. It's not clear that the American public is more ill-informed than it was 20 or 40 years ago. Yeah, that's great. I mean, we have to think about what it means to have an informed citizenry, because I don't think we're ever going to have necessarily informed citizens. And so this is, again, where theory comes in useful if we're thinking of pop quizzes about, you know, what you know about politics, name a Supreme Court justice, who's your member of Congress, et cetera. That may actually not be, the mean measures of these things may not be great measures of how well our democracy is working. I also would note that, and my research resonates with what Yochai was saying earlier. We were doing work on, for example, looking at Twitter and seeing how much of Twitter is, how much of the news-related content on Twitter is during the election 2016 was quote-unquote fake news. And it was not a trivial percentage, 5%, but it turns out that that was concentrated in a very, very seedy corner of Twitter, right? So pretty much 99% of the population barely sees any fake news. And so we see these numbers, and this is where I started with in the earlier comments that look like, whoa, it's such a huge problem. so many, stories shared with the Pope endorsing Trump and so on. This is just this is fake news about fake news, right? And so I think that a lot of the misinformation problem, I'm not saying all of it, but I'm saying a lot of the misinformation problem is really about a very seedy corner of the information ecosystem. In the US, I think in other countries, it's a very different balance, and it's a very different order of magnitude issue because you don't have the robust news ecosystem that we do in the US. And this goes again back to what Yochai was saying about not just for comparative purposes, which I think is scientifically powerful, but also actually the biggest problem, again, this is another bright side. Other countries have it way worse than we do. But that's obviously distressing because if you go to, Indonesia, Philippines, Kenya, and so on, there are all types of dysfunctions and problems in terms of their news ecosystems that existed before, but certainly it feels like they've gotten worse, and it requires a lot more rigorous research. Final point that's perhaps more positive is I do think that this has gotten a lot of attention. I do think that this has started to move the mark, both in terms of industry. I think industry is a bit freaked out about this because they see a real threat to their business models, and they will do the right thing, I hope maybe, after exhausting other options. And that's better than not. I think policymakers are starting to think about this. A lot of possibilities that we could do things wrong and make things worse, but I guess that's not so positive. But I do think that the focused attention it offers some hope in the fact that it's a very focused problem, not a systemic one in the U.S. at least, is also somewhat hopeful. So,
thank you. Offline, David and I will have a discussion about the difference between the level of badness, meaning sort of good being above zero, and the first difference, meaning going from terrible to slightly less terrible. But for now, I'd like to open it up for the audience, and if I could ask the questioners to introduce yourself and your affiliation, that'd be great. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. So we do have a microphone. Here, sir.
Hi, Daniel Goldenholtz from Beth Israel. I'm a neurologist. I take care of patients with epilepsy, and a conversation I have a lot with patients is, isn't marijuana good for me, and shouldn't I use it? They heard it on TV and so forth. And I think that there's probably a lot of analogies between ideas that are kind of misinformed or actually just wrong that get spread through social media and also through traditional media outlets. And I'm just wondering if you folks have some lessons that you've learned from the broader context of understanding communication that might be specifically applicable to medical misinformation.
Who would like to take a swing at this?
Go ahead.
Well, there's just a few thoughts, and it's really interesting. When we think about medicine and science, so the change in relationship between doctors and people, sick people, and so an example of this, and it's sort of an unusual example, but years and years ago, back in the 70s, my grandfather had prostate cancer. Right. And so seeing a doctor and going with my mother, taking him in to see the doctor who wanted a surgical intervention. And at about that time, there was a study, randomized study on hormone-based approach versus surgery, and it suggested that the survival rates were roughly equal. And my mother was not a typical individual. She was an MIT trained PhD economist who knew her methods a lot better than the doctor, who really who did not take kindly to being told that the randomized study was superior knowledge than he was offering. Ironically, the surgical procedure was actually named after him. So that was a little bit of information. So I think, the interesting thing is obviously the median person dealing with this information and is not a PhD economist, say, from MIT. the question becomes how are socio-technical systems identify and sort through information? And so I've been in discussions, let's say with Google, if you look at peach pits cure cancer, peach pits cancer, right? You will find just all this content about how peach pits will cure cancer. Just newsflash, it doesn't, right? And so the question becomes, and this is something that companies like Google and the like are wrestling with, is like what's their role in terms of being quote unquote arbiters of truth? This is like I don't know how many times I've heard that phrase, we don't want to be arbiters of truth. I'm like, tough, you are. And so, part of the challenge that confronts our systems is like, how do we allow, if someone puts peach pits cancer, what are the responsibilities of, let's say, Google or other similar kinds of systems to identify high quality information versus relevant information, which might well be peach pit, here's a page on how peach pits cure cancer. This isn't an answer, it's just sort of an interesting puzzle because there are the peach pit curing cancer people. They want find information too. That then creates a tension with the traditional metric or mode of delivering information about medicines, which is talking to doctors who, and so there is that question of how we wrestle with, people are trying to be well informed about things that are very consequential with them and getting bad information or processing information badly. And I guess I'm laying out some of the issues. I wish I had the answer on this.
Well, I think that there are people who study this in public health, and if anybody in this room does study this, we would love to hear from you. I think obviously the anti-vax or the anti-vaccine movement is probably a really good analogy in that it's incorrect information that spreads not only on social media, but it also spreads in word of mouth, right? Like we know that anti-vaccination enthusiasts tend to congregate in certain areas. And so it's not necessarily just about that information being spread on social media. I think the larger problem is that a lot of trust in public institutions is down, and I think that includes mainstream medicine, right, as well as media. And I think that when we focus on misinformation and disinformation as purely partisan or purely political, we're missing out on a lot of these cases, like, for example, anti-vaccinations, naturopathy, all other kinds of from woo to woo kind of theories that are spread online. So I don't have an answer, but I do know that the people who have been working on how to message to anti-vaxxers have had some trouble coming up with an effective solution.
Yeah. I'm going to link to a comment Alice made earlier about media literacy, and here I'm drawing on my own personal experience as the parent of a 9-year-old. And I don't have evidence this is true, but I suspect that in addition to being generalized distrust in institutions, that the way that they're teaching media literacy, at least to my 9-year-old, which I assume is a fairly common curriculum, is to just be skeptical of everything you read online, right? Because many things you read online are not true, but also because things you read online could have been hacked or changed. Which is a really interesting twist, right? So if we can't trust anything that we read online, then does that sort of spill over, become a distrust of anything, any kind of information, full stop? And I think that this feeds into what's called modal skepticism. So there's this kind of belief that young people are naive and they will just believe anything that's told to them. And research shows that the opposite is actually true, that young people, because they have no basis for evaluating truth, they tend to just not believe anything is possible, right? So if you say I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to be 99 bananas, they'll say I don't think that 99 bananas could possibly exist at the store. That seems like way too many bananas. But I could in fact drive to Whole Foods and get 99 bananas right now, right? It's a trivial example, but when we teach kids to be skeptics of media, we may be doing disservice to folks like medical professionals who have, decades of training and expertise, who can in fact issue declarative statements about the veracity of, certain claims about marijuana, or the effectiveness of vaccines. So I wonder, if there isn't more work to be done there about training kids to be trusting of certain kinds of advice?
My answer is yes. That is to say, the same techniques that are that we use to analyze documents about that and infer beliefs and attitudes from the documents and the patterns of sharing and authority and attention on one side and producers pointing to each other's authority are available for studying the question of health information online. One of our teams has a paper on the anti-vaxxers and the structure of the media ecosystem around the anti-vaxxer movement. What's interesting about that movement is that, like politics, it's identity-driven. It's a way in which people share, and that creates really interesting problems for intervention. So it turns out, for example, that the NCBI is a major node for the anti-vaxxers because they'll pick a story, they'll pick a particular publication, they'll take a line out of an abstract, and then they'll build a conspiracy theory around that. And that becomes just the source of validation because the people actually don't read the underlying materials. Whereas Wikipedia turns out to be a source that's very firmly anchored in the reality-based community because it has enough, it's sufficiently legible and sufficiently self-explanatory to people that it doesn't lend itself quite as well to legitimate claims that are crazy. In general, you can think of three primary sources of error. One is this highly focused group that, like political partisans, uses sharing of information to signal identity, as Alice was describing. So the anti-vaxxers, there's another paper that came out of the same group on fluoridization, and if any of you saw Dr. Strangelove, you know that it's a conspiracy. That has that characteristic, and in some sense you need to think of that as a problem that's similar to cult-like belief formation, and it's not just about mechanisms like Facebook. Then you've got this basic, people just don't know how to assess a site, and so it's really this sense of confusion and misinformation, just because there's such a barrier for intermediation between the health information and the health consumer and user. And I think that's what you were focused on. And again, there, we haven't yet, at least no one on our team has, looked at trying to measure the relative prominence of these sites on any particular issue. But the methods are there and are entirely accessible. The third line is that there's a business in selling snake oil. There has been for millennia. And Natural News and all of these bullshit sites are there with a real need to sell. Impressionistically, and it's a project that my team's going to be doing in the next, it looks very impressionistically, arm waving, this is not data, that there's a lot more of it supporting right-wing sites, political sites, than left-wing sites. And since we see such a vast difference between the degree of insularity, both in terms of attention networks and in terms of producer networks on the right, it's possible that the same systems that feed disbelief in mainstream organizations also make either select for or create a susceptibility to this kind of manipulation. But that's looking forward to research we can do. The short answer is yes, the same tool set can be applied to all sorts of misinformation. No, you can't do any of this just with data science. You always need deep field knowledge of what the potential dimensions are of confusion and what terms, what frames. So you'll run a data analysis, something will come out of you about a certain kind of text. To be able to interpret what that text means, what it implies, what's the community about, you're going to need real field knowledge, which, coming back to the point that Alice was saying about the interdisciplinarity, absolutely critical, can't be done except in combination between healthcare researchers and people doing data science and large-scale document analysis online.
Okay, so we only have, unfortunately, a few minutes left, so I would like to collect a couple of questions if there are, and then ask the panelists for capital C concise responses, something that I know academics really don't like to attempt, but we're going to have to try. So I see just these two hands. So let's get both of your questions, and then we'll throw it at our panelists.
Yeah, I saw recently a 2003 documentary from BBC called The Century of the Self. And basically, it was a consensus among the establishment, I guess at the beginning of the 20th century, that masses needed to be manipulated because they were otherwise emotionally unstable. So if we look at the situation today and all this evidence that comes to the fore versus a situation 30 years ago or 50 or 100, and I come from Italy, so sort of we have we had a collection of newspapers that were all controlled by this, that, or the other, and we were also very skeptical of the American system. So is this simply sort of like a needed reaction and actually an opportunity, because all of a sudden we're all aware of this information being there, and we're all a little more cynical, a little more skeptical, and a little more motivated to sort of do the homework that we need to do?
Okay, last word. If I could ask you to be as concise as possible. Grateful.
Hi, Dustin Tingley, Government Department at Harvard. It seems to me that a lot of the conversations around misinformation presume that people do not want misinformation in some senses. They would prefer the truth. But I'd like to question that for a second. It seems like there's a lot of consumption good, a lot of utility in engaging in conspiratorial thinking. I mean, think about the tabloid line and the grocery store. So it seems like there's a real consumption side to this as well, where people have fun engaging in seemingly wacky things. And so I just thought it would be interesting to try to unpack that role versus other dynamics.
Thank you. So this is the lightning round. You each get 30 seconds. You can take one or both. Why don't we just start at the end?
Yes, it's a century-old problem. Our research suggests that an inflection point in the US happened on the right in the 80s, which connects to your point, where essentially the right became a propaganda feedback loop that made an enormous amount of money, starting with talk radio, moving to Fox News, and now the internet is wrapping itself around it. On the right, it's cost-free because there's no internal contradiction within the system of trusted audiences. It's a completely different dynamic in the rest. That is to say, all the way from the Wall Street Journal to the left. So yes, there is some baseline desire for identity-confirming falsehood, but its fulfillment and how much pleasure you get from it depends on how much you're exposed to actually truth-based stories, and so we have a real bifurcation.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, yes, of course, the world of possible information that we can consume is too vast and complex. We need heuristics in order to focus our attention and to have some collective understanding of what the world is and how it could be. Sometimes when we increase diversity of media, it is fun, right? So we get conspiracy theories that are fun, and so who's pregnant with whose baby, and so on. Other times, when we do that, it reveals underlying complexities that we haven't yet reckoned with, and to the extent that those are real complexities that we need to reckon with, I think that's great. To the extent that it's being infused with sort of falsehoods that then we grapple with, maybe not so great. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, the game playing aspect of a lot of these online communities, I think, is underlooked, because I think people really enjoy feeling like they're figuring out a truth, whether that's somebody who's doing a research report as an academic or somebody who's digging through some enormous amount of stuff to pull out, their conspiracy theories. But I think when we're talking about conspiracy theories and hoaxes and the kind of far-right narratives that are being pushed, there's 2 differences. One is that they're often trying to come up with a very simple explanation for why the world is complicated, like the Illuminati controls it. And the second is that these narratives have very hurtful and harmful consequences because they're racist, they're sexist, and they're deeply anti-Semitic, right? And we have to recognize that there's a big difference between spreading, Princess Diana was murdered by the CIA or something, and George Soros is, this Jewish billionaire who's controlling the world, because that can have real impacts on real people. But yeah, I think we have to assume that when people are doing things, they're not doing them because they're horrible and they hate them. They're doing them because they like them and they're getting some kind of positive, feedback from them.
Last 30 seconds.
Last 30 seconds, 2 points. I think people like to believe things that reinforce their emotional commitments to a certain view of the world. Bad people do bad things. On the other hand, I don't think anyone wants their kid to get sick and die. And so when they don't get their kid vaccinated, I don't think that's a consumption good, right? I think that's just being badly informed and making a bad decision.
Okay, let's thank our panelists for this really interesting discussion.